and working on South Asian religions as well. I don't actually regard myself as a terribly religious or spiritual person, right? Which might make it odd that I'm standing up talking to you. But that doesn't mean that the things that I work on and I study and I read aren't things that I've drawn insights for that I guess have informed aspects of my life. And a little bit today is about those kinds of things, and especially the things we refer to as attachments. Often in what occurs with South Asian religious traditions, once they move to other contexts, particularly in Western contexts, they're removed from a context and they go through some changes and adaptations. And we see that a lot, for example, in psychology, which adapts a lot of ideas that come from particularly Buddhist thought. And you'd probably be aware of the discourse around mindfulness or the practice of mindfulness that is used in psychology. It's actually an adaptation of some Buddhist meditation ideas. And that was led by an American professor of psychology who was also a practitioner of Zen meditation. Clearly these things have been adapted and used in ways that have been very productive for people. And of course, in their original context, they were very productive for people as well. So what I'm really going to talk today about is some early ideas from primarily Sanskrit texts, but also some Pali context. I don't really work on Pali material, but I do lecture about them a bit, that deal with the problem or talk about the problem of attachments and maybe what you can do with them. I've had a pretty stressful 6 months, so it seems very pertinent for me to be talking about this now, because they are in fact often useful life devices. On the other hand, part of what interests me about these is the tensions that where they come from, and then in their traditional context, what kinds of tensions arose as a result of these ideas. So I will actually be talking about that too. So I do a bit of historical contextualization, which is really what most of my work is on. So one of the things that I think, if you look into the intellectual traditions that emerge out of South Asia, and by South Asia, I use that to mean the subcontinent area. India, of course, is the modern nation state that covers a lot of that, but I'd be including the area from where these ideas come includes things that are not in the Indian nation state. That's why I often use the term South Asia as well. One of the features of these traditions at the intellectual level is that they're often about some type of individual transformation. You're trying to transform yourself. So it's not so much about, there is a lot of what we think of as external religion, participation in ritual. There's a heck of a lot of that, and doing that as part of communities. But there's also a lot of focus on how you can transform your own psychological conditions. And that often can lead to often ultimately is called a type of emancipation. And people have different views on what that emancipation might look like, and there are very modern versions of it, where it's really just about social emancipation from injustice. And there's a modern form of Buddhism that really focuses on that. But the ones I'm looking at, they're in a context where people thought that there was a way to transform themselves for the good, meaning ethically, but also perhaps leading towards some sort of emancipatory moment. Right? So I don't mind. When I lecture at UQ, I'm very happy to be interrupted and ask questions, because sometimes I don't always explain myself well, and also sometimes I use words and I forget that not everyone may know what the words mean, especially if they're coming from other languages. So feel free to interrupt as well. All right, I'm going to start with a couple of scene setters. There's a very famous definition of yoga that occurs in the Yoga Sutra, which is a 4th century text, so 4th century of the Common Era, that was composed in Sanskrit, and is really yoga in the way we're going to talk about it now, has a much older history than the Yoga Sutra, but it's the first attempt to be systematic about yoga theory, which at this point is really meditation, right? It's not what we take yoga to be if you go out and start looking to practice yoga, where you're doing a lot of what they refer to as asanas or postures. So we call that often postural yoga. A lot of that is quite recent where it comes from, and it did also come from India, but in fact, the early part of the 20th century, it's adapting things that are a bit older than that. But when we first start getting these sort of yoga discourses that are around transformation, they're really referring to types of meditation practices. So in the second sutra of the Yoga Sutra, a sutra incidentally is a very brief, very nominal phrase, which is what we have here, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Has anyone ever heard of this before, this particular definition? Cool. So, and all that means is that yoga is the cessation of the activity of the mind, right? So it's a fairly simple definition. But one question might be, well, why? Well, why would you want to cease the activity of the mind? And by the 4th century of the Common Era, there'd already been, nearly 1,000 years of practice and thinking about what creates, psychological complexities in people's lives. And I'll go back to some of those origin periods a little bit earlier. The Yoga Sutra is really based in a tradition where there was seen to be a problem with the way that we interact with the world that then creates disturbances in our mind and then also in our lives. And so one answer to that problem was to retract, in fact, your central engagement with the world. Often they use metaphors like, a turtle or a tortoise that retracts its limbs. It was based on an understanding of the senses where your central contact comes from your organ and touches something. And so you try to pull that back in order to cease that interaction. It also means it's embedded within a context of removing yourself from the social world, right? Removing yourself from contexts which might cause all of those conflicts that are associated with social attachments, material wealth, and so on, emotional attachments, etc. So one of the reasons why you want to cease the activity of the mind is, in fact, to pull yourself back from that. And someone who successfully does that was often referred to as someone who is jitendriya, which means that their senses, their indriyas, had been conquered. They'd overcome them. And that was seen to be a feature of sages and ascetics or renouncers, people who specialized in these activities. It's a very individualized pursuit as a form of spiritual or religious behavior as well. So that's sort of, I use that to set the scene. Now I want to do, that's coming out of what we think of as the Brahmanic Hindu tradition, right? It's a Sanskrit text. Yoga, in the way this is understood, becomes one of the 6 darshanas or philosophical systems of the Hindu tradition. It's often coupled there with another tradition called Sankhya, which has a cosmology that's used by the yoga tradition as well. One little thing I'll say about this yoga tradition too, it's dualist. It's not a monosystem as you would get in what's often referred to as Vedanta, or particularly non-dualistic Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. It's dualist. The objective is to come to an understanding where your consciousness, what they call purusha, and then that's usually then understood to be cetana, which means consciousness, is radically separated from all of the material matter of the cosmos, and that includes things that make up your thinking, seeing, feeling individuality. Right? So now let's have a think now in a Buddhist context of something similar, and I'll have to put my glasses on. Now, I'm not familiar with how much you all know about Buddhism and Hinduism, so sorry if I do explain some things you already know. Unlike the Brahmanic Hindu tradition that dealt with the notion of the self, the word they typically used was Atman, as sort of an eternal and unchanging entity. The Buddhist tradition really emerged as a response to that in some respects. There's a little bit of a debate over, the early context of the two different ideas that's still ongoing. But I think it's best to understand that Buddhism arises largely in contrast to that idea and develops an alternative view that, in fact, there is no self. And they call that the anatta or the Anatman doctrine, depending on whether you're in Pali, the early texts, or then Buddhism Sanskritizes later on and it starts using Sanskrit. And, often when I talk about the Anatman doctrine with students, that's they find that fairly confronting, because I think people, come with a conception of selfness that includes a soul without necessarily thinking too much about what that might be and how you would identify it, how you would separate that from your emotional experience or your sensual experience in any way. But the Buddhists did try to do that. I think someone's at the door.
Can someone turn off the doorbell just behind you there, Vivian? Just behind you, near the floor.
That's all right, I'll continue. They really want to get in. Now, what's important to understand here is that they had a conception of the individual, which was made up of, in its early form, 5 things that were referred to as khandhas or skandhas. Pali, that's Pali and Sanskrit. And they're simply the things I've got in red there. Form, so the things you see, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And what you'll see there is that they're mostly interested in not the material things we can see and touch, but rather the things that go on inside our minds, and they have different ways of classifying those things. This is a real feature of the Buddhist tradition, and it's partly why it becomes quite adaptable for modern psychological practices, because it's so focused on the mind and how you can control your volitions and how you can actually alter the way you're thinking about the world for potentially and hopefully a more productive way about viewing the world. Now, one of the reasons they introduced this doctrine is because they diagnose one of the sticking points of our existence as human beings is that we tend to be very concerned with holding on to things, attaching to things. And from a Buddhist theorizing perspective, it starts with the notion of a self, which you then start to own in psychologically unproductive ways. And so this is an example from the Alagadupama Sutta. These are all text references. I'm not sure if do you have Pali Text Society editions in your library? You might have them. That's what the PTS means. And you can go to the Majjhima Nikaya, and if you go to volume 1, page 130, this is where you'll find that text. Therefore, monks, whatever form, whether past, future, or present, in oneself or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all forms should, with right wisdom, thus be seen as it is. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. And whatever feeling, whatever perception it goes through, it's the same type of formula. And the idea there is that you don't misidentify an experience that you're having, which is perceptual or it's emotional. Often it's involved in a network of social relationships over which you don't have much control. Those experiences are not actually something that you identify with in an unproductive way, that they are constitutive of your being in the way that they'd argue that you might think a soul is. And of course, for Buddhists, that's an error in thinking, and therefore they think that there's no self. They didn't mean there's no individual, right? They just meant that there's nothing in any of us, and ultimately they extend this to all things. There is nothing permanent and unchanging. And that's really the key to understanding this doctrine, is that they have a prior definition of what a self or a soul is. That self or soul is something that never changes. It's permanent at all time. And can you identify one of those things? And if your answer is, well, actually, no, I can't, well, maybe you're a Buddhist, right? And you just didn't know it. That is, in fact, often a challenge I put to my students, because they often have trouble with this idea that we don't have souls. And I said, well, I don't know, identify it. And do you have an experience that doesn't change? Do you have a sense of your body that doesn't change? Do you have a sense of your experience in the world that never changes? And I think pretty much none of us ever have those things. And so that's what they meant by there's no self doctrine, right? All things are always changing. And so therefore our problem is, well, how do we live in that world and how do we deal with that change? And one way you deal with that change is by not being focused on an experience lasting forever, because that, of course, inevitably leads to suffering, because you're not going to be happy when your good experiences pass and move into something else, as they inevitably will. Right? Now, this takes on sort of different forms. I think we're all aware of the language of mindfulness. In Pali, that term is usually sati, and there's a famous sutta called the Satipatthana Sutta where they go through mindfulness practice, and it has particular objectives. This is actually not from the Satipatthana Sutta, but it reflects the same sort of idea, and it's about identifying experiences as being constituted by three things, and those things are they're impermanent, and because they're impermanent, they're subject to unpleasantness, or what they refer to as dukkha. Sometimes, well, in fact, mostly that's translated as suffering, which is why partly Buddhism sometimes gets a rap as a bit of a negative tradition, but of course they give you a way out of that suffering, so maybe it's not, maybe it's in fact an optimistic tradition. Where am I? And no self. They're the three marks of existence, right? So all of our experiences are subject to those three things. So in this particular sutta, what do you think, monks? This is always the way the sutta is represented. It's the Buddha speaking to a bunch of monastics, who are referred to as bhikkhus. What do you think, monks? Is material form permanent or impermanent? It's impermanent, Lord. But is what impermanent unpleasant or pleasant? It's unpleasant, Lord.
I didn't get that.
Siri often asks me inappropriate questions at inappropriate times. For some reason, Siri never understands a word I say, unless I don't want her to understand, and then she does understand. Now, I think this is an example of dukkha, actually. This is suffering. Luckily, it's impermanent because she did go quiet. All right, so what is impermanent, painful, subject to change? Is it fit to be considered thus? This is mine, this I am, this is myself. Certainly not, Lord. What do you think, monks, is feeling, is perception, and mental formations? And it goes through, again, the five constituents of the self and repeats the same thing. It's actually that sort of repetition is indicative of the systematic thinking that goes on in the text, but also its orality, because a lot of these Pali compositions appeared prior to written form, and so repetition actually helped with the transmission of the ideas. I think it's kind of curious that in modern, I'll tell you, I always think this is kind of hilarious. At UQ, they roll out a lot of student services, and one year they decided to have a mass mindfulness session before the semester started, and the goal was to break the world record. And I kind of felt like they missed the point of mindfulness if you're trying to break world records. You know, you're sort of attached to a goal, you're identifying it in maybe unproductive ways because the chances are that someone else has done more, they just didn't write it down or whatever, I don't know. But this is a peculiar thing, that when these things are often taken out of their context and then they're appropriate and adapted for other things, things sometimes are lost or change. And what's interesting about mindfulness and, in fact, yoga is that in contemporary settings, they're often used as ways to become better versions of ourselves. You know, I'm using kind of tropes or that you see out there. Better business people, better performers in the social world, better athletes is really common. Mindfulness is adapted a lot for athletes, which is all kind of well and good, but it does seem to remove its association for what its ultimate objective was, which was really as some sort of emancipation, psychologically cultivated by the individual. Right? Now, in mindfulness disciplines, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to have a deep insight into the nature of the three marks of existence, simply by being aware of your psychological processes, your feelings, your physical feelings. And you witness these things coming, and then they're there, and then they go. And so you get an insight thereby into impermanence. And then if you can come to have a way of being comfortable with that impermanence, then some of the dukkha, or this unsatisfactoriness that comes around by wanting to hold on to experiences, can dissipate. And that, of course, is tied to the no self doctrine, because if you believe in a selfness, you're holding on to an experience as if it can be eternal, and you're identifying it with yourself in a deeply implicit way. Right? All of this was regarded as kind of unhealthy and unhelpful thinking. A nice example of it even comes down to the nature of Buddhist teachings themselves. And there's a very common simile that recurs, in fact, through the Buddhist tradition called the simile of the raft. The raft is the teachings. It's what they refer to as dharma or dharma. And the objective of the raft is to do what rafts do, is to get you on to the other side. Right? And so typically going from one side of a river or an ocean to another side in Indic discourse is a metaphor for going from this world to the other world, which might be a form of emancipation or liberation. The purpose of the raft is actually just to get you over there, and that's it. And so the raft simile is about not being attached to the teachings in an unhealthy way. It's to let them go once their purpose has been done. It's often surprising, I think, for people to discover that there are forms of violent Buddhist nationalism in the world, and one of the things that drives them is protecting what they refer to as the sasana or the shasana, which includes, of course, the teachings, the dharma. I fear that it's going to go away, or it's being threatened by other people. Of course, they don't seem to be aware of the Raft simile, which is quite an important idea within Buddhist teachings. All right, so if those two, those Buddhist ideas and that definition of yoga as really meditation in the Yoga Sutra sets the scene, where does all that come from? Where do those ideas emerge? Because, I'm not religious, as I said when I started, but I'm a Buddhist to the extent that I don't think things have been around here forever. They emerge in time and then they change. With these particular ideas, we have in South Asian religious culture, you can map it for quite a long period of time because there are some incredibly old compositions. In fact, the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Sanskrit compositions that probably was composed in 300 or 400 years from about 1500 BCE, is really the largest corpus of composition in an Indo-European language, because actually Sanskrit is related to English and so on in a deep historical sense. People who spoke early forms of Sanskrit, most likely, most scholars would say, came from Central Asia and migrated down in waves over a period of time and settled first as pastoralists in the Indus Valley area, and then gradually kind of moved across, merging and mingling with people who were already within the northern areas of South Asia at the same time. Now, those early compositions don't reflect any of the ideas I just said. Right? Those early compositions, which were poetry and very profound and sophisticated poetry in metrical forms, were then adapted for a liturgy and a very incredible ritual liturgy that was reached its most elaborate form in a bunch of compositions called the Yajur Veda that start being composed maybe around 1200 BCE, a little bit after, no one's exactly sure. That is, in fact, the central form of religious expression, as far as we can tell, up until maybe 800, 700 BCE, when there's a bit of a shift, right? And so that's a ritual culture. It's focused on the idea of karma, karman, really in Sanskrit, as ritual action, as a doing. And in the doing of every ritual, you're essentially recreating the cosmos in much the same way as the gods perhaps once did as well. And so by performing ritual, you're enabling the world, the cosmological structure to continue. Now, at some point in time, ideas seem to shift. And we see them in the Brahmanic Hindu tradition with a new bunch of compositions that are regarded as canonically part of that early period called the Veda, but their ideas gradually become more and more distinct. And those texts are called the Upanishads, sometimes collectively referred to as the Vedanta, because they're at the end of the Veda. Conveniently for us, they're kind of historically at the end of the Vedic period, but they're called the end of the Veda because when the arrangement of Vedas, they appear at the end, right? It's not necessarily because of the historical question. Now, in the two oldest Upanishads, who's heard of the Upanishads before? Some people have, right? The two oldest are referred to as the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, and the other one's referred to as the Chandogya Upanishad, and there's another one called the Jaiminiya Brahmana Upanishad. They're at a very early period, probably 7th century BCE, 6th century BCE. One scholar in particular in the world actually argues that some of the ideas I'm going to talk about now are post-Buddhist. Most other people would say they're pre-Buddhist, right? But it's these texts that we start seeing some quite new ideas, including the notion of karma as just action that has an ethical consequence for your life, so retributive action, which is not quite as embedded in the early Vedic tradition. Right? When these really come together is a little bit later, 5th to 4th century BCE. More of these Upanishads are being composed, and Buddhism and Jainism appears. Actually, though, in different parts of South Asia. So that circle on the left, if I can go back one, that's the heartland of early Vedic ritual. And then the one on the right is the heartland of the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism in an area that was referred to as Magadha. So around the 5th century, we also get BCE, we also get the second period of urbanization in South Asia. And that's probably a contingent factor in some of these new ideas that are starting to emerge. The first urbanization period, by the way, was the Indus Valley civilization, which collapses around 1800 BCE as a connected civilization. So we go into a second urban phase in this period, and we get the emergence of competing religious ideas. The one that's key with the ascetic movements is the idea that you can renounce ritual action, right? You can leave behind performing certain rituals that actually, by doing those rituals, you spend a period of time in heaven, and then you just come back to earth and you do those rituals again, right? That was referred to in some of these earlier Upanishads as the way of the fathers or the ancestors. And the objective of that was just to, you perform the rituals, some of which were to feed your ancestors while they're in heaven, to be in heaven for a while because you did them well, and then to come back. And that wasn't really a problem. At some point in time, they decided it was a problem, and they wanted eternity. They wanted permanence. And so they developed another path, which was in the early form referred to as the way of the gods. And the way of the gods, why do they call it that? Because they want to be immortal. They want to be immortal like the gods. And that meant not doing rituals, but focusing on ascetic practices, austerities, contemplation. So we start getting the emergence of meditational disciplines. And all of these are exercised towards the notion that by understanding the self, the Atman, you can understand the cosmos, right? So it's what we think of as through the microcosm, you can understand the macrocosm. In the ritual period, the microcosm was the ritual arena. And if you understood that well, you could control the macrocosm, which was the cosmos, because all the elements in the ritual reflected the elements in the cosmos. In the Upanishadic period, the ritual arena now is the body and the self. And if you can control that and control the mind, well, then you have some sort of outward control as well. The Upanishads are really interesting because they've got a lot of different ideas in them. They're associated a lot with what today is referred to as non-dualism. They're actually dualist ideas in some of them as well. Some of the really interesting things, though, is you can see the internal dynamics of the tradition changing and developing. You get some of the later Upanishads, one in particular called the Mundaka Upanishad, which was composed maybe around 2,000 years ago, which just rejects the Veda. It's a part of the Veda, but it rejects the Veda and it rejects ritual totally, right? And by that point, these sort of ascetic ideas, these renouncer ideas had really become kind of powerful notions that were in ideological terms becoming quite dominant. Even though in reality, only a small group of people would have been able to do them. And why is that? Because to do these sort of things, it means not getting married, not having kids, not having a job. It means being supported by everyone around you. It means doing bodily privations, which are quite difficult, developing meditation to a high degree, which is quite difficult as well. So they were kind of individualist activities, right? Where someone just works towards their own salvation. Now, I've got to keep putting my glasses on because one of my dukkhas is that I'm getting old and my eyesight's dying. Now, coming out of that period where we really are dealing with two broad religious vocations, and this is the same whether you're talking within Buddhism, even and the Brahmanic Hindu tradition, and in Jainism. I'm sorry I keep saying Brahmanic Hindu, it's a reflex. It's because the word Hindu is actually relatively recent, right? And so is the word Hinduism, which is English. And so that's partly why I do it. And I say Brahmanic because the texts were composed by Brahmins as a social group. And, a lot of the time we're not really sure how much they were used outside of those circles, right? It's quite a difficult sociological problem. So we have two broad religious vocations. One focused on the householder. Now, I've shown a temple. Does anyone recognise this temple? This is actually in Brisbane. This is the Sri Selva Vinayaka Koil down at South Maclean. It's a Ganesh temple. It was built by the Tamil-speaking Sri Lankan community. It's the most traditionally designed temple that we have in Queensland. It's built in a Dravid or a South Indian style. I go down there, it's cool, they're very welcoming. Weekends they have a cafe and you can get dosas and idlis and South Indian food of that type, or Sri Lankan food. Now, in the time I've just talked about, they didn't have temples. Temples didn't really appear, temple culture didn't really appear in the Hindu tradition or the Brahmanic tradition until maybe around 2,000 years ago, but it doesn't really gather pace in a significant way until the Gupta period. So from about the 4th century onwards. All right. But I represent the householder by that because that's what householders were. They were thinking of it as a religious vocation. They were people who got married. If in the Vedic period, you couldn't perform one of the rituals unless you were married, right? You had to be married. And then your objective was to have kids, right? So it was a vocation that tied into a domestic life. But it also was one where the goals of an ascetic were not your goals. Your goals as a ritualist were really not, the expectation was you wouldn't reach a permanent sort of eternal answer to the existential problem. And on the other hand, we have the ascetic. Now, I took this photo myself. I don't know who's been up in the Himalayas, but that thing behind there is a glacier. This is where the source of the Ganges, or one of them, starts at a place called Gaumukh, the Cow's Mouth, which is at the top of one of the feeder rivers. It's about 4,000 meters up in the Himalaya. And that guy there he's a sadhu. He's an ascetic, right? He's a sadhu means a good man, but he's a wandering ascetic, a tradition that's been going on for well over 2,000 years in this part of the world. And he's clearly got something that I don't, because that water's really cold. And when he hops out of that water, he doesn't put more clothes on. That's all his clothes. That's all he's got, right? And there is a group of them, and some of them were camping in that region. If you go further up, there's an area called Tabovan, which is actually made famous by the Mahābharāta, which is entirely snowed in most of the year. And there's an ashram up there, again, with people such as this guy who live up there right? So these sort of traditions have been obviously going on for a long time. He's not married. He's not having children. His whole objective in life is to seek these sort of eternal answers. At least that's the basic model. So we had really from about 2,500 years ago the emergence of a tension where we had two distinct religious vocations. And then we go into a period where people try to work out how do we deal with the tension between them. And it's got a lot to do with attachments. The householder is someone who has attachments. It's the nature of being a householder. Who's got kids? Right, if you've got kids, they're pretty significant attachments. And as a parent, there's a lot of the time you're not really in control of your emotional responses to those attachments. That's one reason why ascetics don't, avoid. They're usually celibate and they're not having children, because those experiences of sex and having children and so on are clearly ones that involve stronger emotional and physical responses that are actually embedded within attachment issues. Now, how are we going for time? I've got to keep track of that because I can lose track of time, as someone who's used to me talking knows. Now, I'm going to give some examples of. Oh, is that all I got? Jesus, I'm going to be flying. I'm going to give some examples of some of the issues that these arose. So, one of them is I work a lot on the Mahābharāta, this great epic text, and the Mahābharāta has got a big story about war between cousins, but it's got lots of small texts that are little parables or little stories about ideas and so forth. And one of them is the story of King Janaka and the Bhikshuni. Who knows what Bhikshuni means? Have you heard that before? It's the typical word used in a Buddhist context for a nun, right? For a woman who's taken the ordinations and become a nun. But it was more generally used for women ascetics. Literally, it means that they were beggars. The masculine version was bhikshu or bhikkhu in Pali. Right? They're going around begging for the food, and why are they doing that? It's because they've renounced the world. They're not economic actors themselves. They rely on other people to feed them. Now, in this particular story, King Janaka, a king from Mithila in the northeast, claims to be, whilst he's a king, liberated. So he's achieved moksha. So the question is, can a person whose job, i.e. to be a king, and we can take that to be a version of the householder, can they also become liberated as well? The answer of this text is most definitely not. And Janaka, you're a fool. It's quite interesting how the nun convinces him of this, or the bhikshuni. So she goes essentially to Mithila to test him on this notion. And in doing so, she takes possession. She kind of enters him, possesses him, and they have an interior dialogue. It's a little bit funny. It's also kind of complicated, and some of the issues in the story, in the ideas, are a little hard to work out exactly what they mean. But by and large, she demonstrates to him that he's not, in fact, in control of his attachments, and he's prone to judgment, and particularly of her. One of the factors in the story was that he suggested that the fact that she'd entered him in a possessive kind of way was a breach of social norms, because he didn't know if she was from the same social group, right? And she, of course, points out that, so what, you're a bit attached to these social groups, are you? These are important ideas for you. I thought you said you were liberated and free of these sort of notions. And of course he wasn't, right? So in the end, the answer to this, the idea that King Janaka is putting across there as someone who's engaged in the world through a doctrine which was known as karma yoga, the yoga of action, he could still, in fact, be liberated. He could be reach the goal of the ascetics. Now, there are other kind of versions of how they kind of married these two notions. There's a very important idea that emerges in Brahmanic thought called the ashrama system. In fact, I'm going to refer to it in the plural, the ashrama systems. Has anyone heard of these before? All right, now you're probably aware of the word ashram, right, as a place you go, a built environment where ascetics toil, right? And the toiling is what is referred to as shramana, which became a word for an ascetic. That's not quite the usage here. An ashrama is like a station in life or a vocation in life. And there were really two main versions of the ashrama system, one which preceded the other. In the first one, these four things, the celibate student, the householder, the forest hermit, and the renouncer, were lifelong vocations as religious vocations, and thereby not intention, in a sense, right? So if you were a renouncer, then that's what you did. From the time you got through your studentship, you'd renounce. If you were going to be a householder, you'd do your studentship and then become a householder. You could stay a student forever if you like, right? And I've been at universities for a long time, so maybe that was my choice. Though, of course, I have children, so there's a complication. And then, of course, there's a forest hermit. Now, what that still does, though, is separate the goals that these different vocations can lead to achieving for different types of religious vocation. By about the 1st century of the Common Era, a new version of this idea appeared that set them in a sequence, and this is often referred to as the ashrama system. And it was done in a text that's called the Manusmriti, or the Manavadharma Shastra, sometimes translated as the Law Codes of Manu. And it goes simply like this, that you have a quarter of your life in the studentship, and then you go and become a householder for a quarter of your life, and so you can have children and you're economically productive. Then you go into semi-retirement as a forest hermit, and then in the last quarter of your life, you become a renouncer, right? And they use the term typically sannyasin. In earlier versions of these ideas, they didn't always use the term sannyasin, they often used the term bhikshu, actually. And so you become a renouncer. And what this effectively does is takes what for householder ritualists was a challenge to their social system, i.e. the idea that you could not get married, not have children, and not perform the rituals. The rituals keep the world sustained, right? So if you have too many renouncers, who's going to perform the rituals? And critically, who's going to perform the rituals to feed the ancestors in heaven? This is a very common story again in Sanskrit literature of a renouncer wandering around and encountering these dudes hanging upside down in trees or in caves. And as they start talking, it dawns upon the renouncer that that's actually the renouncer's own ancestors. And why are they there? Because they've dropped out of heaven. And why has that happened? Because the renouncer didn't perform the ancestral rituals that kept them fed. So what do? If you want to maintain or appropriate the renouncer ideals without undermining the householder ones, where you create a sequence where you perform these sorts of things at particular parts of your life. Now, there's another resolution to this. In fact, there are more than one other resolution, but the one I'll go to now is the way the Bhagavat Gita, a very famous text, which is part of the Mahābharāta. It's before the battle between the cousins in the Mahābharāta, where Arjuna has a bit of a crisis and decides he doesn't want to fight. And the reason he doesn't want to fight is because he looks across the battlefield and he sees his own family and his teachers, his gurus, and he knows he has to kill them if he goes to war. And then he starts worrying what will happen to the women in the family after that. Right? It's not actually about non-violence. That some people took it that way. Gandhi read it as a text about non-violence, but quite differently, as a kind of a broad allegory. Essentially, in the context of the Mahābharāta, Krishna, who's the Ishvara or the God, is trying to convince Arjuna to actually fight, right? And so partly what he does in that is tells a story about, or gives a doctrine, we call the Karma Yoga doctrine, which I mentioned earlier, as a way for someone who's doing their social actions, i.e. people who might be, if we want to think about other contexts, be married or having children or have a job, and still become liberated. And the doctrine adapts renouncer ideas that complicated our relationship with attachments for people who are embedded in contexts where they're inevitably in attachments, right? As I think we'd all kind of grasp. Incidentally, this slide includes a photo of a postcard I picked up in my first trip to India, and it's a Gita side. It's a summary of the Gita in Hindi. It's very brief, and often the focus when people summarize in this way is a scene where Krishna in Book 11 reveals his supernal manifestations as all the divine forms of the universe. So it's got this is a brand new theology in this tradition. It didn't appear before, where he announces himself as what he has in his hand, the Ishvara, which is kind of the Lord or the God that manifests all other sorts of divine forms. Now, that of the guy down in the corner on the left is Arjuna, the one who's sort of seeking the answers. So the way the Karma Yoga doctrine, Karma Yoga meaning the method of action, works is that instead of renouncing actions, which is what renouncers did earlier when renouncer doctrines first appeared, and by action they meant particularly ritual, by this point in time, social actions were understood as simply social versions of ritual action and therefore embedded with cosmological maintenance, just like ritual actions were. You don't have to renounce those things. What you renounce are the fruits of those actions. And so, in fact, you then, by renouncing the fruits of your actions and giving yourself up to God in this version, which is Krishna, then you can also reach a version of immortality. This has a very theistic version of that immortality where you become essentially not quite one, but very close to Krishna in a heavenly context. And so it's still a renunciation discourse, but it universalizes it and makes it something that anyone can obtain. And it becomes a method, in fact, for dealing with attachments. With attachments are your problem. Because if you're not focused on the fruits or the goal, then you stay in the present, right? And you focus on what you have to do. Yeah.
What year was that?
That normally we think that the Bhagavad Gita was composed about the 1st century of the Common Era. We'd also mostly argue that it was what we refer to as an interpolation in the Mahābharāta, which was composed over a period and had material coming from different contexts. The Mahābharāta actually does not have a coherent, or that's not the right word, a systematic theology. Even the Gita, you could argue, doesn't quite. It has slightly different ideas. But clearly, people were thinking and coming up with these sort of new notions. And so really that's kind of my end point. I think that if we think about the Buddhist context, those ideas around mindfulness and how they can be applied in everyday life, which is what's occurred in the modern psychological traditions that are adapting Buddhist ideas, and what we have in a notion like this, these are devices or methods by which we can deal with our daily attachments in order to psychologically improve ourselves. And if you're embedded within a certain religious or spiritual context, that might in fact be liberation or emancipation. I think I got there on time. I'm 3 minutes over. That wasn't, I pulled that back, I thought, time-wise. Thanks very much for your attention. Any questions are fine. Whatever you like. Yep.
Sorry. I was